Welcome to This Explainer. We're jumping right in today because we're diving into a concept that is going to fundamentally flip everything you assume about high-agency individuals and so-called rebel entrepreneurs entirely on its head. You know, we tend to look at out-of-the-box thinkers, those people who navigate high uncertainty with total calm, and we assume they're just genetic anomalies, right? We think they were born with some rare magical spark that the rest of us somehow missed out on. But today, we're unpacking a really fascinating idea that argues this is actually a profound misunderstanding of human nature. High agency isn't a rare mutation at all. But to understand why, we really need to completely reevaluate our relationship with education, society, and the rapidly approaching AI era.
To kick things off, there is this incredible quote from David Rogier, the founder of Masterclass. In a conversation with AI pioneer Fei-Fei Li about the future of work, Rogier completely dismantled the myth of the born innovator. He pointed out that agency is not an immutable trait. Instead, it's a composite of specific behaviors and environmental conditions that can be cultivated, or, and this is the crucial part, suppressed. This is a massive paradigm shift. It means that the intense drive we so heavily praise in successful builders and creators isn't just something you either have or you don't. It's a fire that's either carefully stoked or methodically extinguished by the environments we place ourselves and our children into.
Okay, so what do we actually mean when we say agency? Well, simply put, it's that internal drive to command technology rather than being commanded by it. It's the capacity to act, to build, and to make decisions without sitting around waiting for a permission slip or group consensus. It's that sheer willingness to pursue what others might consider totally impossible. And in an age where technical skills can literally become obsolete overnight, having this internal disposition is the true differentiator.
Now here's where it gets absolutely wild. Every single child is actually born with the raw components of agency. They don't show up as perfectly polished adult virtues, obviously, but rather as raw, unconditioned human tendencies. Think about these 5 defaults. First, curiosity. Watch a 2-year-old with a running tap or a TV remote. They want to take it apart and see how it works, and they certainly don't need a syllabus to do it. Second, resilience. Think of a toddler learning to walk. They fall hundreds of times and nobody is there grading their failure. Third, risk-taking. Kids will naturally climb up things they aren't even sure they can get down from. Fourth is a problem-solving focus, that visceral drive to fix a broken toy just because the friction of it being broken is genuinely irritating. And finally, the rejection of external praise. An infant absolutely doesn't need anyone's endorsement to trust their own judgment. These 5 traits, they are our natural baseline.
So, if we are all born with these traits, where on earth do they go? Well, former New York State Teacher of the Year, John Taylor Gatto, had a pretty provocative answer to this. He made a structural claim about our education system, arguing that beneath the official academic curriculum, the very design of the industrial classroom teaches what he called hidden lessons. And to be clear, he wasn't blaming individual, hard-working teachers at all. He was pointing out that the structure itself, the bells, the age-batched rooms, the grades, the whole permission-seeking culture, systematically condition students, regardless of anyone's good intentions.
When you map Gatto's hidden lessons against those natural traits we just talked about, it paints a really stark picture. When a school teaches intellectual dependency, always waiting for the authorized answer, it completely suppresses natural curiosity. When problems are always assigned by someone else rather than discovered organically, it breeds indifference, and that destroys our innate problem-solving focus. Add in constant surveillance in the public exposure of wrong answers, and you immediately suppress risk-taking. The rational response is just to play it safe. And perhaps the most damaging part, when a child's worth is tied to provisional self-esteem via grades, failure goes from being just useful data to actual personal damage. That entirely destroys resilience. The system quietly, methodically cancels out our native agency.
Which leads to a really fascinating realization about the people we tend to look up to. Those highly praised innovators, the rebel entrepreneurs out there building our future. They aren't actually exceptional genetic anomalies. No, they are simply the lucky few who survived 12 years of systemic conditioning without being fully processed. They're the kids who taught themselves to code on random internet forums, or who just couldn't stop tinkering with broken things even when the curriculum told them to focus elsewhere. What we constantly marvel at as superpowers is really just the original human default that the schooling machines somehow fail to train out of them.
Think of it kind of like a video game metaphor. We can compare what we might call NPC mode to PC mode. An NPC, a non-player character, represents that manufactured passive state where a person just follows the handed-down script, they wait for prompts, they avoid mistakes at all costs, and they constantly seek approval from systems they didn't even design. Contrast that with the awakened player character, the PC mindset. The PC asks questions. They seek internal alignment over external approval. They actually learn from their attempts rather than dodging mistakes, and they learn to read the actual terrain in front of them rather than blindly following a pre-drawn map.
And this brings us to the absolute core, paradigm-shifting thesis of this whole explainer. Agency is not a skill you teach. Agency is a state you return to. You don't need to install resilience. You literally just need to stop punishing a child for falling. You don't teach risk-taking. You just stop surveilling them for deviating from the norm. It is so incredibly empowering when you realize that we don't have to build agentic humans from scratch. We simply need to stop dismantling the incredible agency that learners already bring into the world with them.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter so urgently right now? Because a learner's inner disposition fundamentally changes how they wield modern technology, specifically AI. The contrast in how these two mindsets operate is huge. An NPC learner who's been conditioned by years of seeking the right answer just to get a good grade is going to treat AI purely as an answer machine, a shortcut to spit out outputs they don't actually understand. But an awakened PC learner, they treat AI as a thinking partner. They argue with it, they challenge it, they interrogate it, and they command it. The difference isn't the tool. The difference is entirely in who is holding it.
Let's ground this in reality with a super cool anecdote about a 14-year-old student who was operating within the Open PMC or player mode character framework. This student noticed that younger kids were just blindly copying AI answers. But instead of ignoring it or waiting for a teacher to fix it, she turned it into a project. She researched, she tested prompts, she built a simple AI guide to help them ask better questions, presented it to her peers, and then revised it based on real feedback. The final product wasn't some perfectly polished masterpiece, but that didn't matter. The process itself was the education.
And you want to know the craziest aspect of that entire project? It comes down to a single number: 0. 0 of those 5 core traits we talked about earlier: curiosity, resilience, risk-taking, problem-solving, rejecting praise. 0 of them were formally taught as academic subjects during her project. Yet every single one of those native traits was naturally exercised. Curiosity kicked the whole thing off. Risk-taking happened the second she presented an imperfect idea. Resilience kicked in during the revision process. Her independence developed naturally because the work was judged on whether it actually helped people, not by some arbitrary letter grade.
Which brings us to a really stark economic reality. For decades, the industrial economy needed people who could reliably follow procedures, so the low-agency schooling bargain actually kind of worked. But AI completely shatters that bargain. If we train students solely to follow instructions, produce fluent answers quickly, and seek algorithmically manufactured approval, we are preparing them for a world where machines do all of those things infinitely better and infinitely faster. The very behaviors that once made a person a reliable employee now make them entirely replaceable. Passive compliance? It's simply no longer a viable survival strategy.
So, how do we fix this? Let's talk about restoring the player character, using what's called the Open PMC Protocol.
This protocol isn't just some light curriculum reform. It's a total restoration architecture for human development based on very specific environmental conditions. First, mentor-led relationships replace those rigid teacher-to-student authority hierarchies, totally removing intellectual dependency. Second, learning happens through project-based quests anchored in the learner's own questions because curiosity requires real stakes. Third, AI is positioned right from day one as a thinking partner, shaping a proactive disposition. And finally, the absolute elimination of external grading cultures. By refusing to treat grades as the primary measure of worth, learners are basically forced to develop their own internal standards. And that right there is the absolute bedrock of genuine resilience.
Which leaves us with a deeply provocative question to grapple with. If the biggest loss of our current system isn't just economic, but rather the loss of curiosity, judgment, and the sheer ability to act without permission, then we have to ask ourselves, if the AI era automates compliance, are we merely failing to prepare students for the future workforce, or are we fundamentally failing to prepare them for personhood? It's a powerful lens to reevaluate our own conditioning and the environments we're building for the next generation. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.